The water off the coast of the Kola Peninsula is so cold it can stop a heart in under 3 minutes. On a moonless night, sometime in the late 1960s, the exact date is still withheld in a sealed file at Kew, a swimmer broke the surface beside the hull of a Soviet vessel and did not gasp. He had trained himself not to. Bubbles rise. Bubbles betray. A breath in the wrong place could end not just one man's life, but an entire understanding between London and Moscow about what the other side knew. He was a Royal Marine. More than that, he was a member of a unit so closely held that men in the regiment beside him, the Special Air Service, Britain's celebrated soldiers of the shadows, did not know precisely what he was doing, or where, or for whom. They knew the name. Everyone in that small world knew the name. The Special Boat Service. But knowing a name and knowing a mission are two very different things, and in the architecture of British secrecy, the SBS occupied a chamber that even other secret men could not enter. This is the strange paradox at the heart of our story. The SAS would become famous. Hereford would become a household word after a balaclavaed figure abseiled down the front of the Iranian embassy in 1980, live on the evening news, while the nation watched their tea go cold. The SAS were secret soldiers who became celebrities. The SBS were secret soldiers who stayed secret, and stayed secret on purpose, because the work they did could not survive daylight. Why? Because the SBS did not fight the Cold War the way the films imagine it. There were no tank columns, no dramatic firefights on a Berlin street. The Cold War that the SBS fought was fought underwater, in the dark, against the clock, with a knife and a notebook and a tolerance for fear that would break most men. They surveyed Soviet harbours. They photographed the undersides of warships. They went places the Royal Navy could not officially admit a British serviceman had ever been. And they came home and said nothing, not to their families, not to their friends, and frequently not even to the men they served beside. Whitehall liked it that way. The Joint Intelligence Committee liked it very much indeed, because here was a capability that could deliver the one thing the Cold War craved above all others: certainty, without ever leaving a fingerprint. A spy can be turned. A signal can be intercepted. But a man who swims into a Soviet anchorage, counts the hulls, measures the defenses, and slips out again, leaving nothing behind, that man is a ghost. And a ghost, the planners understood, was worth a fleet. So how did a small band of Royal Marines, descended from a wartime experiment in canoes, become the single most secretive instrument in Britain's Cold War arsenal? How did they end up knowing things that prime ministers were only briefed on in whispers? And why, even today, are their operations buried under embargoes that stretch decades into a future none of us will see? To understand that, we have to go back past the frozen fjords and the silent submarines, back to a Britain that was exhausted, broke, and clinging to the wreckage of an empire. A Britain that had just won the largest war in human history and discovered, to its horror, that winning had nearly finished it. That is where the story of the most secret men in Britain truly begins. In 1945, Britain stood victorious and very nearly bankrupt. The war had been won, but the cost had hollowed out the nation that won it. The treasury was empty. The cities were scarred. Bread, of all things, would soon be rationed, something that had not happened even at the darkest hour of the U-boat blockade. Clement Attlee's new Labour government inherited a country that had spent its last reserves and pawned its future to survive, and the brutal arithmetic of the post-war world was already becoming clear. Britain could no longer afford to be everywhere. And yet, Britain still believed, deep in the marrow of Whitehall, that it must remain a great power. This was the central contradiction of the age. The empire that had spanned a quarter of the globe was beginning to come apart. India, the jewel, the keystone, would be gone by 1947. The map that school children had been taught to read in confident imperial pink was about to be redrawn, and the men in the Foreign Office knew it, even if the public did not yet feel it. Britain was a first-rank power running on second-rank resources, and something would have to give. What gave was conventional strength. You cannot maintain a navy that rules every ocean when you cannot pay for the coal. So Britain made a choice that would define its entire Cold War posture. If it could not be strong everywhere, it would be clever everywhere. Intelligence would do what divisions no longer could. The country that had cracked Enigma at Bletchley Park, that had run the most sophisticated deception operations in the history of warfare, understood that knowledge was the great force multiplier, and knowledge was cheap compared to battleships. Then, in March 1946, an old man stood up in Fulton, Missouri, and gave a name to the new danger. Winston Churchill, out of office, but never out of influence, declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, a new adversary had risen, and it was not the Germany that Britain had just defeated. It was the Soviet Union, Britain's wartime ally, now its existential rival. The alliance of necessity had curdled into the confrontation of the century. The trouble was that the Soviet Union was a closed box. Stalin's empire was a fortress of secrecy, its intentions opaque, its capabilities a matter of frightening guesswork. How many submarines did the Soviets have? And where? How quickly were they building? Were the rumors of new harbours, new bases, new weapons in the frozen north true, or were they shadows? Whitehall did not know. And not knowing, in a nuclear age, was the most dangerous condition a state could be in. The Royal Navy, in particular, faced a nightmare. Its entire doctrine rested on command of the sea, and command of the sea now meant understanding a Soviet fleet that hid in the Arctic and the Baltic, behind minefields, patrol boats, and a wall of paranoia. Photographing it from the air invited an incident. Sailing close invited an incident. What was needed was a method of getting eyes onto the most sensitive targets in the Soviet inventory, eyes that could see and then vanish, leaving no trace, no protest, no headline. The chiefs of staff understood the requirement perfectly. They simply lacked the instrument to fulfill it. The Grand Special Forces of the war had been disbanded almost the moment the guns fell silent. The SAS gone, the commandos slashed to a fraction. But buried in that wreckage of demobilization was a small, stubborn capability that nobody had quite managed to kill. A handful of men who knew how to approach a hostile shore from the sea and survive. The seed of something that Britain was about to need very badly indeed. To find the roots of the SBS, you must go back to the desperate improvisation of the war years when Britain had nothing to fight with but ingenuity. In 1940, with the continent lost and invasion expected daily, a Royal Marine officer named Roger Courtney had an idea that his superiors thought borderline insane. He proposed that men in flimsy, collapsible canoes, foal boats they were called, could paddle from submarines or fast boats onto enemy coasts, gather intelligence, plant charges, and slip away before dawn. To prove it, he reportedly paddled out to a depot ship, climbed aboard undetected, and walked into a meeting of senior officers carrying a piece of equipment he had stripped from the vessel. The point was made. The foal boat section was born. What followed was a tangle of small units with overlapping names that historians still argue about. The Special Boat Section, the Special Boat Squadron, the various canoe and beach reconnaissance teams that operated in the Mediterranean and beyond. The most famous of their wartime cousins were the Royal Marines Boom Patrol Detachment, the Cockleshell Heroes, who in December 1942 canoed up the Gironde estuary to mine German blockade runners at Bordeaux in Operation Frankton. Of the 10 men who set out, 2 came home. Churchill himself was said to regard the raid as one of the most courageous of the war. The lesson was written in the blood of the men who did not return. A few determined individuals could strike at targets a fleet could not reach, but the price of failure was absolute. After the war, the inevitable axe fell. The sprawling Special Forces empire was dismantled with almost indecent haste. But the maritime canoe capability survived, lodged within the Royal Marines, evolving through the late 1940s into what would eventually be formalized as the Special Boat Service. It was tiny. It was poor. It trained in cold British water with surplus equipment and a doctrine handed down from men who had learned it the hard way. And it answered, crucially, to the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines, not to the Army, not to the same chain of command that would resurrect the SAS in the 1950s. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. When the SAS was reborn, first in the jungles of Malaya, fighting communist insurgents, then formalized at Hereford, it grew into the Army's instrument, eventually the glamorous public face of British Special Operations. The SBS grew up separately in the Sea Service, with a different culture, a different purpose, and a different relationship to secrecy. The 2 units were cousins who rarely compared notes. And in the compartmentalized world of British intelligence, that separation was not an accident. It was a design feature. Because the SBS's natural employer was not the battlefield. It was the ocean. And the ocean was where the Cold War's most sensitive secrets lay. The Soviet Northern Fleet at Murmansk and Severomorsk. The Baltic Fleet behind its screens of mines and patrol craft. The new generation of submarines that Whitehall feared but could not count. Who better to creep up on a Soviet harbour than men whose entire existence was built around approaching a hostile coast unseen from the water and leaving no wake? By the early 1950s, the pieces were aligning. A Britain hungry for intelligence. A Royal Navy desperate to understand its adversary. A small, deniable, intensely capable unit answerable to the Admiralty. And across the Iron Curtain, an opponent building a fleet in the dark, confident that the cold Arctic waters and the paranoia of the security state would keep its secrets safe. The Soviets were about to discover that the British had a habit of finding things out. They simply would not discover how. The moment that hardened British resolve and revealed the terrible stakes of underwater intelligence did not involve the SBS at all. It involved a man named Lionel Crabb, and the disaster that bore his name became the cautionary tale against which every subsequent operation was measured. Buster. Crabb was a Royal Navy frogman of genuine wartime fame, a diver who had cleared mines and inspected hulls in the Mediterranean. By 1956, he was middle-aged, fond of a drink, and past his best. But he was available, and he was deniable. That April, the Soviet leaders Bulganin and Khrushchev sailed into Portsmouth Harbour aboard the cruiser Orjonikidze on a goodwill visit. The British wanted to know about that ship, its hull design, its propellers, the secrets of its underwater configuration. And so, in an operation tangled up with MI6 and conducted with what would later look like criminal carelessness, Crabb slipped into the harbour to take a look. He never came back. Months later, a headless, handless body in a frogman's suit was recovered from Chichester Harbour. It was buried as Crabb, though the identification was, conveniently, impossible to confirm. The Soviets protested. The press erupted. Questions were asked in the Commons, and Prime Minister Anthony Eden, already a fortnight from the catastrophe of Suez, was forced to stand up and refuse to explain, declaring that it would not be in the public interest to disclose what had happened. He reportedly ordered the relevant files sealed for a century. Some remain sealed to this day. The Crabb affair was a humiliation, and Whitehall learned from it with cold precision. The lesson was not that underwater reconnaissance was too dangerous to attempt. The lesson was that it must never, ever be done amateurishly again. An aging diver, half briefed, sent into a hostile hull in a friendly harbour during a state visit. This was the work of enthusiasts, not professionals. If Britain was going to swim into the most sensitive places in the Soviet world, it needed men who were trained to a standard that left nothing to chance, organized under a discipline that left no loose ends, and held so secret that no minister would ever again have to stand at the dispatch box and improvise a lie. This was the SBS's moment, though no announcement marked it. In the aftermath of Crabb, the serious, deniable, maritime reconnaissance of the Soviet fleet migrated towards the men who did it properly. The amateurs were finished. The professionals took over. And the professionals understood something that Crabb's handlers had forgotten. The entire value of the work lay in the silence afterwards. A successful operation was one nobody ever heard about. The greatest triumphs of the SBS in the Cold War are, by definition, the ones that produce no headlines, no bodies, no questions in the House. Consider what that demanded. To approach a Soviet anchorage in the Arctic, a swimmer might be launched from a submarine sitting in waters where its presence was itself an act of breathtaking risk. The diver breathed from a closed-circuit oxygen rebreather, no telltale bubbles, in water cold enough to kill. He had to navigate by compass and feel, photograph or measure his target, and return to a submarine that might have been forced to move, in darkness, with his air running down. A single mistake meant capture, and capture meant an international incident that could shred a decade of careful diplomacy. Or it meant death in the cold, and a body that must never be allowed to surface wearing a Royal Marines tattoo. The stakes could not have been higher, and the margin for error could not have been thinner. The question now was whether men could actually be found to do it, and whether the secrets they brought back would be worth the appalling risk of going. Picture it then. The confrontation that never made the news, reconstructed from what the men who served have been permitted to say and what the shape of the Cold War tells us must have been true. A British submarine lies on the bottom of an Arctic fjord, engines stopped, hull creaking under the pressure, every man aboard breathing as quietly as he can. She has come hundreds of miles into waters the Soviet Northern Fleet considers its own front garden. Above her, somewhere in the black, lies the target. A harbour, an anchorage, a new class of vessel that the photographic interpreters back at Jarek have been arguing about for months. Aerial reconnaissance can show the planners a shape on the water. It cannot show them what lies beneath the waterline, and beneath the waterline is where the secrets live. The propeller design that betrays a submarine's speed, the sonar dome that reveals its hunting power, the hull form that tells a trained eye exactly what Moscow has built. In the forward compartment, the swimmers prepare. The ritual is precise and unhurried, because hurry kills. The dry suit, sealed at wrist and neck. The rebreather checked and rechecked because a closed circuit set that fails does not warn you. It simply lets you slip into unconsciousness without a sound. The camera in its waterproof housing, the slate and pencil for notes, because memory under that kind of stress is not to be trusted. The compass board, and the cold, mathematical knowledge of exactly how long the oxygen will last, and exactly how far the swim is, with no margin left over for the unexpected. Then the lockout. The chamber floods. The pressure equalizes with a roar that feels like the loudest sound in the world, and the hatch opens onto absolute darkness and cold that hits like a physical blow. The swimmer kicks away from the steel sanctuary of the submarine, and now he is alone in the most hostile environment on Earth, in the most hostile waters in the world, with the entire Soviet security apparatus a few hundred meters away, and no friend within 1,000 miles who could admit he existed. He navigates by the luminous dial of the compass and the count of his own kicks. The target rises out of the dark, a vast steel cliff of a hull, blotting out what little light there is, and here the work begins, the slow, methodical survey, measuring, photographing with a flash that must be shielded so it cannot be seen from the surface, running gloved hands along fittings, counting blades on a screw, noting the depth of a keel. Every second spent beneath that hull is a second closer to discovery, and the cold is working on him the entire time, stealing the strength from his limbs, fogging the edges of his mind. This is where training becomes everything. The amateur panics. The professional counts, records, and moves, and then the return, arguably the hardest part of all. Finding a darkened submarine in a black sea, perhaps shifted from its station, perhaps running low on its own margins of safety, while your air gauge falls towards the red. Men have died on the way home from a perfect mission. The sea does not care that you succeeded. When the swimmer finally clips back onto the guideline and is hauled into the flooding chamber, when the water drains and the hatch swings open and warm air and human faces return, he carries something extraordinary back into the light. Certainty. Hard, measured, photographic certainty about a corner of the Soviet war machine that Moscow believed no foreign eye would ever see. And the submarine turns for home, having been, officially, nowhere at all. The cost of this work was paid in a currency that rarely appears in the public ledger, which is precisely why it has been so easily forgotten. There were no campaign medals struck for swimming into Soviet harbours. There were no parades, no dispatches read out in the commons, no honours gazetted with the true citation attached. A man might receive a decoration for services of a confidential nature and take the real reason to his grave, and many did exactly that. The most obvious cost was the lives. The Crabb affair gave the public a single, sensational glimpse of what could go wrong. But the men who served in the silent decades afterwards understood that diving and small boat work of this intensity killed people even in training, let alone on operations. Cold water, equipment failure, the brutal physics of pressure and oxygen. These took a steady toll that was never tallied in any public figure. Families were told their husbands and sons had died in an accident or an exercise and were given no further detail because no further detail could be given. The grief was real. The explanation was a locked box. To lose a man and be unable to say why, or where, or for what. That is a particular kind of burden, and the regiment carried it without complaint, because complaint was not in its nature. Then there was the psychological cost, harder to measure, but no less real. Consider what it does to a man to live a double life of this depth, to come home from weeks away and tell his wife nothing, to sit in a pub and let friends believe he does some dull, administrative job in the Marines, to know that the most important thing he has ever done is the one thing he can never, ever speak of. The discipline of secrecy is corrosive. It isolates. The SBS culture of saying nothing, of shunning the limelight that the SAS would eventually embrace, was not merely operational good practice. It was a way of life that asked these men to disappear, in a sense, even while they were still walking around among us. There was a strategic and diplomatic cost too, or at least a constant strategic risk. Every single operation carried within it the seed of catastrophe. A captured swimmer, a recovered body, a Soviet patrol boat in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Any of these could have detonated a crisis between two nuclear-armed blocs. The men who authorized these missions in Whitehall were quite literally gambling the credibility of British diplomacy on the skill and nerve of a handful of Royal Marines in the dark. Had it gone wrong, the fallout would have landed on the Foreign Office, on the Prime Minister, on the entire edifice of the special relationship and the NATO alliance. That it so rarely went wrong is a testament to the calibre of the men involved. But the risk was carried, night after night, year after year. And what did Britain learn? It learned that intelligence gathered with absolute deniability was worth more than its weight in gold. It learned that a small, superbly trained, utterly silent capability could deliver insights that fleets and squadrons could not. It learned the hard discipline of compartmentalization, that the surest way to keep a secret is to ensure that even your own allies, even your own celebrated sister regiment, simply do not know it exists in any meaningful detail. The price of that knowledge was high, paid quietly, by men whose names we may never properly know. But Whitehall judged it worth paying. And the strange truth is that they were almost certainly right. The cumulative effect of all this silent labour was to make the SBS something close to indispensable and yet almost invisible, a combination that perfectly suited the British way of doing business. As the Cold War ground on through the 1960s and 1970s, the unit's role expanded well beyond reconnaissance of the Soviet fleet. The men who had mastered the sea and the cold and the art of going unseen turned out to be ideally suited to a whole new category of threat that was rising fast: the security of Britain's offshore infrastructure. The discovery of North Sea oil changed the strategic calculus entirely. Suddenly, Britain had, scattered across hundreds of miles of grey and hostile water, an array of platforms and rigs that were the beating heart of a new energy economy, and that were appallingly vulnerable. A handful of determined men could seize a rig, hold its crew hostage, and threaten an environmental and economic catastrophe. Whitehall recognised the danger, and the question of who could possibly retake a platform in the middle of the North Sea in a gale against armed opposition had only one sensible answer. The SBS, with its unique marriage of maritime skill and special forces capability, became the guardian of Britain's offshore wealth. It was work that demanded everything they had learned in the cold. And again, it was work done almost entirely in the dark, away from the cameras. This deepening of the maritime counter-terrorist role ran in parallel with the SAS's own rise to public prominence. And here, the two cousins finally, fully diverged. When the SAS stormed the Iranian embassy in 1980, they became famous overnight, the public face of British resolve, mythologized in books and films and breathless newspaper profiles. The SBS watched their sister regiment step into the spotlight and made a deliberate choice to remain in the shadows. The motto tells you everything: by strength and guile. Not by glory. The SBS had spent decades learning that their entire value lay in being unseen, and they were not about to surrender that advantage for the sake of a headline. The relationship with the Americans deepened too. The Cold War at sea was a NATO enterprise, and the intelligence the British gathered about Soviet naval capabilities fed into a shared Western picture that underpinned the whole alliance. Britain, no longer able to match the superpowers ton for ton, had found a different kind of currency: specialized, high value, hard won knowledge that bought it a seat at the top table and a degree of influence over American strategy that its raw economic weight could no longer justify. The frogman in the fjord was, in his small way, helping to keep Britain great long after the empire that had once defined that greatness had melted away. By the time the Cold War approached its end, the SBS had become a permanent and prized fixture of the British defence establishment, even as the public remained almost entirely ignorant of what it did. Its operations stayed classified, its successes stayed unspoken, its dead stayed quietly buried under euphemisms. And the files, the real files, with the dates and the places and the targets, stayed locked in the archives, embargoed not for years, but for generations. That secrecy was not bureaucratic timidity, it was the whole point. A capability whose value depends on the adversary never knowing it has been used cannot be declassified the moment the shooting stops, because the methods endure, the relationships endure, and the men who use them deserve the protection their silence bought. Which raises the final question, the one that lingers as the Cold War fades into history. What did all this secret striving actually mean? The legacy of the Cold War SBS is a strange and quiet one, and it tells us something profound about the kind of power Britain chose to become in the second half of the 20th century. This was a nation that had been the workshop of the world and the ruler of the waves, and that found itself, after 1945, unable to afford the role it had played for 2 centuries. The grand fleets shrank. The imperial map faded from pink to a scatter of independent flags. And Britain made a choice, not always consciously, not always coherently, but unmistakably, to convert what it had lost in mass into something it could still command in quality. The SBS is that choice made flesh. A handful of supremely capable men, costing a fraction of a single warship, able to reach into the most closely guarded corners of the adversary's world and bring back the one commodity that mattered more than any other in the nuclear age: knowledge that the other side did not know you had. In an era when a misjudgment could end the world, the ability to replace guesswork with certainty was worth more than any number of battalions. Britain could no longer overpower its rivals. So it learned instead to understand them better than they understood themselves. And the men in the cold water were a vital part of how it did so. There is something deeply British about all of this. The refusal to boast, the instinct to do the hard thing quietly and let others claim the limelight, the belief that the deepest forms of strength are the ones that never need to announce themselves. The SAS, for all their genuine brilliance, became a brand, a legend, a recruiting poster. The SBS chose a harder and lonelier path, to be the secret behind the secret, the unit so closely held that even Britain's other secret soldiers did not know the half of what they did, by strength and guile. It is a motto that could stand for the whole of Britain's Cold War, outmatched in strength and so compelled to win by guile instead. And the silence endures. Even now, decades after the Berlin Wall came down, the records of these operations remain sealed, the names withheld, the truth parcelled out in fragments that researchers piece together with patience and frustration in equal measure. Somewhere in the archives at Kew sit files that will not open in our lifetimes, files about men who swam into the dark for their country and never told a soul. We owe them an acknowledgement, even if we can never have the full account. They kept the peace by knowing the enemy, and they kept the knowing secret so well that we are only now beginning to grasp how much we owe them. So perhaps the real lesson of the SBS is this: that the most important things a nation does are sometimes the things it can never talk about, and that true service does not always come with a medal you can wear or a story you can tell. These men accepted that bargain without flinching. The least we can do is remember that the bargain was made. What do you make of it? Was Britain right to keep these men so deeply in the shadows, even from its own celebrated SAS? Or is there a cost to a democracy in burying its quietest heroes so completely that we may never know their names? I'd genuinely like to hear where you land on that, so drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this brought a forgotten corner of our history into the light, do give it a like and subscribe for more stories from the secret edges of Britain's past. There is always another file waiting to be opened.